So this unit looks at reasons that America experienced technological growth. Well, it looks like at America's Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And so we're going to start out by looking at reasons that there was growth. One big reason is the rise of lots of new technology, especially the iron and steel industry. One thing that was really important is you have the Bessemer process. Henry Bessemer invents a new process that converts iron into a more durable, so it's stronger and more versatile, meaning you can do more with it, steel. It allows us to produce steel in large dimensions and great quantities. And the steel industry feeds so many more industries. And so we see the steel industry starts in Pennsylvania and Ohio, where you already have an iron ore industry. You also have coal for the process. Pittsburgh, that's why you have the Steelers in Pittsburgh. Later areas where you see the steel industry: Michigan, Minnesota, Birmingham, Alabama, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago. And there's a great relationship between transportation and steel. The railroad needs the steel for locomotives and tracks. You also have the emerging petroleum industry, mainly for lubricant. The automobile's not as widespread at that point. Lamp oil, that sort of thing. The automobile is just getting its start. You've had the invention of the internal combustion engine, a gasoline engine, and finally Gottfried Daimler, Daimler, invents the first automobile engine. Henry Ford did not make the first automobile, but in 1896 he makes his first automobile. And the auto reshapes culture, social landscape, the physical landscape. As far as airplanes, Wilbur and Orville Wright, they do their glider with an internal combustion engine in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. However, until after World War I, most early development happens in France for the airplane. The corporations that were emerging at the time were very fearful of competition. So the government was putting less money into corporation. You were having the development of government researchers. And you had private research, and it was diversified. And the trend moved into practical research. How can we use this process? Corporations, as a result, put money into universities to promote research. Taylorism is a theory of scientific management where you're going to subdivide the task in order to speed up production. That way, a business is not that reliant on a single individual, and it reduces the need for skilled workers, which really comes into play when we start talking about the labor movement of the time period. Part of that Taylorism is mass production, which is what Henry Ford is known for. Again, he didn't invent the assembly line, he perfected it, especially what we call the moving assembly line. He changed building an automobile. It took 12 and a half hours to build a car. He lowered it to an hour and a half, or maybe a half hour. He raised wages and reduced labor. He raised the wages because he wanted his workers to be able to afford his car. He realized, if I want to sell my product, people have to be able to afford to buy my product. But his changes reduces the price of a car from $950 to $290. And now, as far as the Model T, one of my favorite lines from Henry Ford is, you can have a Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. couple of other things about the railroad. It is becoming the primary means of transportation. As railroad opened new routes, you had lumber industry, farming. Chicago becomes kind of a central hub, especially as a slaughterhouse. Talked about the cattle industry. They would go from like Abilene, Kansas, into Chicago for slaughter. An interesting thing is the reason we have time zones is for the railroad. It creates a standard time, which is going to prevent, trains from crossing. We have a whole lot of small lines consolidate into major corporations under people like Cornelius Vanderbilt. We call them the railroad barons. And it's the beginning of the modern corporation. 4 names and businesses you need to know. Vanderbilt, railroads. Andrew Carnegie, steel. J.D. Rockefeller, oil, Standard Oil. Carnegie was U.S. Steel. And J.P. Morgan for the banking industry. Some terms as far as the way business was changing are corporations. Corporations emerged as a means of raising companies, of raising capital for your business. You would invest, you would get stock in your company, and you would consider that a good business. You have some consolidation going on, merging businesses together. Horizontal integration means all the similar businesses are combined into one. I already mentioned that with Vanderbilt, but we see this also with Rockefeller. He owns, for example, all of the refining businesses, all of the oil refineries. Vertical integration means the businesses are all involved in all. In vertical integration, you own all the businesses that are involved in all stages of production. Andrew Carnegie called it mine to market. And so U.S. Steel was mine to market. He owned the resources. He owned the means of production. He had deals with the railroad. So he owned all means of production. Standard Oil, John Rockefeller, used both methods, both horizontal and vertical integration. He bought out competing refineries. He was even involved in barrel making, pipelines, freight cars, marketing. He controlled 90% of the industry. And these guys believed that competition would eventually create instability. Now, some people did not like these and tried to limit the businesses being able to do this, and so trusts start forming. It's a combination of companies. Holding companies are a central body by stock of companies in the trust, establishing an ownership of the core. And then a monopoly, of course, is one business controlling all of the business. And obviously, Rockefeller had a monopoly on the oil market if he controlled 90%. To help you remember monopoly, controlling it all. Remember, when you're playing the game, you have a monopoly when you control all 3 or all 2 of a particular color. So capitalism is, of course, a form of economy. And during this time period, you have 1% of the corporations controlling 33% of the manufacturing. So they had really enormous power, but they also created jobs. They stimulated the market. They built infrastructure. They would pay for the railroad to be built. They would pay for roads later in order to get their product to market, and it benefited everybody. Same thing with communication lines. They would want to be able to communicate, so they would build telegraph, later telephone lines, and that benefited everybody. And so you have a very, this capitalist culture emerges. Horatio Alger was an author who wrote rags to riches stories, novels where someone who had nothing became very rich. But now very few of these millionaires were self-made men. Most of them started from wealth and privilege. Carnegie being the exception. Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who came to America with nothing and built himself up. You do have corruption. They make contributions to politicians. And they eventually, the theory of social Darwinism emerges. Of course, when we think of Darwin, we think about the theory of evolution, the survival of the physically fittest. Well, in social Darwinism, it's also about survival of the fittest. The most intelligent is going to be the one that succeeds. Those who were successful in economics were so because they had a hard work ethic. Those who failed were lazy and therefore not fit to survive. Only the most fit would flourish. And this is a concept put out by Herbert Spencer. And it advocated that people therefore should have the absolute freedom to compete, to succeed, and to fail. And the wealthy use that to support their success. This is why we're succeeding, because nature deems it so. And they use it to justify some of their less savory tactics. Now, I was talking about Carnegie being a true rags to riches story. And as such, he writes what comes to be known as the Gospel of Wealth. Basically, he says great wealth has great responsibilities toward social progress, that you should give excess wealth to help the poor. But it's not like he was standing there handing out money to people standing on the corner of the street. He gave money to institutions that would help the poor help themselves, like libraries, Carnegie Hall for the Performing Arts, museums, universities, hospitals. Vanderbilt University is founded by Cornelius Vanderbilt with this concept of Gospel of Wealth. But at the same time, there are criticisms of capitalism. The farmer and laborer were a threat to wealth and authority being distributed. There was corruption. And as we get into the labor movement, we see more criticisms. Monopolies create high prices. There's an unstable economy. Production sometimes outpaces demand. And that leads to a succession of very bad recessions. The greater the corporations grew, the less chances individuals had to succeed. There were fewer opportunities. And so there becomes a resentment to the gross wealth that the workers display, or that the wealthy display. So on one side of the coin, you have your captains of industry, like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. Those, because of the criticisms, they're sometimes also called robber barons. But who was on the other side of the field? The workers. Who were our workers? We have a lot of rural dwellers moving to cities. With mechanization, you don't need as many people working the farms, so they were letting go laborers and they were coming to the city to work. You also have immigration. About 25 million people, 4 times the amount in any previous period. And these are different immigrants. You have a lot from Southern Europe, like Italy, Greece, the Slavic nations. You also have them from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland. They're escaping poverty, political and religious oppression, and they see America as these new opportunities, and are recruited sometimes with misleading promises by the railroad or by industrialists. And this leads to increased racial tension as lower paid immigrants take jobs. Because if I demand you to give me a raise, there's somebody getting off the boat who will work for less than I'm working now. So you're going to hire that person and say, forget your raise. The average worker's salary was $400 to $500 a year. $600 is the poverty level. It's $600 a year to have a reasonable level of comfort. What's the average? $400 to $500. And even then, your wages and your job, you don't have a lot of job security because of changing technology. Also because of the constant boom and bust cycles that we see going through the economy. Working conditions were not very nice. It was repetitive. There was a strict schedule. There's not a lot of skill that you need to work an assembly line. Long hours. They would work 6 days a week. It was unsafe, unhealthy. There was a loss of control through existence of managers, so the workers felt kind of out of control. 17% of the workforce was women, and that was often to supplement the husband's income to get them up to that $600 poverty level. 75% of the women who worked were under the age of 25 and daughters of immigrant. They could do machine labor, but not necessarily manual labor. So we see them in the textile industry. However, their wages were usually $200 less a year than males. Children, 10% of all girls and 20% of all boys worked, and that put about 1.7 million. The families need the extra money. Also, some families choose for the children to work instead of the mother. One misleading thing is with agriculture, probably about 60% of the children who were working in agriculture, but they were exempt from child labor laws. And what child labor laws existed, like that you had to be 12 years old, you were only allowed a 10-hour workday, were largely ignored. And so with some of those conditions, we start seeing the rise of labor unions, and specifically looking to combine several unions to make their efforts stronger. The National Labor Union is a variety of reform groups, but there's not a whole lot of connection with actual labor. And after the Panic of 1873, they decline. And they exclude women because they think women drive down wages. If there's a man and a woman applying for a job, they're both physically capable of doing the job, and I can pay $200 less for the woman to work than the man, I'm going to hire the woman. The Knights of Labor rise in 1869 under Uriah Stevens. They are open to almost all workers and professionals, skilled and unskilled. They include women. They're loosely organized, and their main interest was a long-range reform of the economy. Their second leader is Terence V. Powderly, and the Knights of Labor become more public, but local groups don't necessarily obey Powderly's instructions, and so you have several strikes that fail. It weakens the Knights of Labor, and they eventually fade away. So the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, and the AFL in a particular form does still exist. Mainly skilled workers, though, not your factory workers, people who have a skill. And these emerge from the old craft unions. Your leader has the best name ever, Samuel Gompers, Gompers. Again, they're opposed to women being in the workforce, but they say pay women equally. That way, if I have a man to hire and a woman to hire, they can both do the same job, but I have to pay them the same amount. I'm going to hire the man because that's what I'm supposed to do. They were opposed to government intervention. They felt like the government could pass laws, but then the government could change those laws. So they focused on the relationship between the workers and management. Their immediate goals were better wages and conditions, and their first demand was an 8-hour workday. On May 1st, 1860, AFL has a general strike, which means you have several strikes across the country in various industries, all working for the same goal. For this time period, you have 4 major labor movements, strikes, actions, whatever you want to call them. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 happens because there was a 10% cut in wages. The railroad workers go on strike, and it disrupts service from Baltimore to St. Louis. And it turns violent. The equipment is destroyed. There are riots. And so finally, President Hayes orders federal troops in to stop it. Some demonstrators are killed by troops, and more than 100 die. And the strike fails. But this is a national strike, and it's evidence that we have moved into a national economy because this one strike cripples so much of the nation for a short period of time. There's a resentment emerging towards the employers and the government, and it's really evidence that the union movement isn't going to be very strong. Now, Haymarket Square is less of a strike. It was a protest. You had people from the McCormick Harvester Company in Chicago who were at strike, and there was a protest meeting at Haymarket Square. A bomb goes off. Now, nobody knows who started it. 7 police officers are killed. 67 people are injured. The police fire and kill 4 people in the crowd. Now, what Haymarket Square does is it fuels a dislike and a distrust of the labor movement. The labor leaders are looked at as radicals, as anarchists. In fact, you have 8 people arrested for inciting the event, and they're anarchists. They're sentenced to death. Anarchists really wanted a new social order and were peaceful. They weren't violent, but they become the symbol for terror and violence, and this really hurts efforts of the labor union. Homestead strike happens in 1892. Homestead is one of the plants in the U.S. Steel conglomerate. And so you have iron and steel workers. Early on, they have some power because they have some skills. But new methods of production are weakening their clout, their power. And so when the wages are cut at the Homestead plant, in an effort to weaken the union, there's a lack of discussion and negotiation, and there's a call for a strike. Henry Clay Frick, who is Carnegie's second in command, shuts down the plant and calls in the Pinkerton Guards, which is basically a private security force. When the guards arrive at Homestead, the strikers meet them, and violence follows, and the Pinkertons basically surrender and get back on the boat and go back to Pittsburgh, I guess. So the federal government sends in the National Guard to protect strikebreakers. And after 4 months, the strike fails, and they realize they can't do anything about the increasing reliance on unskilled labor. Like I say, that the difference between skilled labor and unskilled labor really leads to some of this early failure of the labor movement. The Pullman strike happens in 1894. Pullman built sleeper cars and parlor cars for the railroad, And he had designed a company town. So the workers had the place where they lived and worked and shopped were all controlled by the Pullman Company. As a result, the Pullman Company set the prices, like in the grocery store. And it almost starts a cycle. You know, if I'm a worker and I need flour, I can borrow against my wages at the company store. And then when my check comes, they take that out before they pay me. What happens is the Pullman Company cuts the wages by 25%, but they do not cut the current rent. And so the Pullman workers strike. And again, an example of national economy. In sympathy, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, and we're going to hear Debs' name several times, they don't really go on strike, but to support the Pullman strikers, they refuse to handle Pullman cards that come into their rail yard. So they won't transfer the cars. The cars end up backing up in the railroad yards. They're fired for not. Some of them walk off the job. And basically, transportation from Chicago to California is frozen. The U.S. Postal Service is interfered with. Eventually, the U.S. government intervenes and forces the strike to end because of all of that. So, why wasn't the labor movement successful? Well, only about 4% of the labor force were members of the union. So there's not a majority who were trying to organize. It excludes unskilled workers, women, blacks, and a lot of time immigrants. And for various reasons, the immigrants, some of them didn't plan to stay in America, so they didn't see any point in organizing. Also, your workers as a whole were highly mobile. They frequently moved jobs. They frequently moved towns and locations. And there was also enough mobility that occurred that gave workers hope. They hoped for that rags to riches. And if the boss is looking to give somebody a promotion, and I've been known to be involved in union activity, I'm not going to get that promotion. And the corporations were determined to crush the unions through any means necessary. And the big thing we see is the federal government coming in on the side of the corporations.